That's what my role was for a month and a half or 2 months when Timothy McVeigh blew up the Oklahoma City courthouse, or federal building, the Murrah Federal Building. These trucks that would show up at a carnival to sell, cotton candy and T-shirts were there. I mean, it was really just a surreal atmosphere that lasted all night with
Wow.
people just waiting for this execution. A woman on I-69 outside of Fort Wayne, she was going like 80 miles an hour in a convertible with a wedding dress on, with the whole train and everything in the back, and she had a cake, and she was going to marry Tim McVeigh.
Hi there, and welcome to another episode from the Vault. This interview is with Jim Casey. Jim Casey had a stellar career in the FBI and retired as a special agent in charge. He not only played a crucial part in solving the Lockerbie bombing, but he also had to scramble to help out collecting information before Timothy McVeigh's execution. This is a really wide-ranging interview, and I hope you enjoy it. Today, we're joined by another FBI agent, Jim Casey. How are you doing today, Jim?
Great, thank you. Good to be here.
It's good to have you. And one thing I love, and I was just talking to you beforehand, and I've spoken to, 9 other FBI agents. And what I love about having everybody on is the fact that every one of you is somebody different. Now, you ended your career as a special agent in charge. Is it SAC or SAIC?
Okay, that's a great question to start off with, because in the FBI, it's always SAC. Many of the other agencies, especially the legacy treasury agencies like Secret Service, ATF, are pretty comfortable with SAIC. But the Bureau has always been pretty adamant that we call ourselves the SAC. And by the way, we don't run that acronym together as the SAC either. That was like day one at Quantico. You would never refer to the boss as the SAC of anything. Other agencies are a little less formal about it. They don't mind doing that.
Well, there's the connotation that you probably tell.
Let your mind run wild.
You're really, really annoyed with the boss, the SAC, right? Now, I'm sure that's a factor. And I'm sure, and I can't help but think of J. Edgar Hoover not wanting it to be said that way.
Exactly. Exactly.
So, and that's something that I've kind of learned over time is everything does go to Hoover. Is that a fair analogy?
It's a fair analogy. I mean, he died in 1972. I came in the Bureau in 1987. There were a lot of longtime agents that said he didn't really die. Don't let him fool you.
Well, that's cool. Now, you were telling me about your career a little bit, very briefly, but I mean, you just did some amazing things. What was your specialization? Because everyone I've spoken to, they've done something different.
It's funny because at the Bureau recruits you for some specialties. And I remember, my last Sunday when I was the SEC in Jacksonville, we go to these conferences. All the SACs would come together, and Bob Mueller was a director at the time. The one thing we all agreed upon ourselves, we would never let Bob Mueller know if we had an agent who was a Mandarin speaker working bank robberies on our squad, because it would drive him crazy. He thought that everybody in the agency or in the organization, was working that specialty they were recruited for. And that just wasn't the case. We had accountants doing fugitives. We had, lawyers working white collar cases. I mean, people would kind of gravitated towards what they were eventually going to work. I was a police officer before I came in the FBI, and I was a diplomatic security agent for a couple of years before that. So I had a pretty varied background, and I mostly did violent crime in Detroit, in a pretty long-term undercover case too, not as the undercover, as the agent who kind of invented the undercover and then ran it. But then I gravitated toward international terrorism in the middle 90s, long before it ever kind of really became, the problem that it is today, at least the recognized problem that it is today. And I was, for a good part of the middle of my career, as I was working my way through management, I was involved in national security and counterterrorism, counterintelligence. Toward the end of my career, and what happens to a lot of more senior managers is you end up, really being an executive and running operations at a higher level. So, for example, when I was in Jacksonville, I mean, I was responsible for all the investigations.
Now, there's only so many offices in the FBI. Like, I'm guessing there's one in Jacksonville. Is there another in Florida? How many actual what do you call them? Stations, are they?
Well, they're field offices. And so there's 56 field offices across the country. And then there are a number of sub offices we call resident agencies that work for those field offices. So in Florida, there's the Miami field office, the Tampa field office, and the Jacksonville field office. And to further the example, we had 7 sub agencies, sub resident agencies that work for Jacksonville, places like Tallahassee, Pensacola, Gainesville, Fort Walton Beach, those smaller cities that didn't justify a full field office. Maybe only 2 to 8 agents worked in those offices.
Okay, so you were kind of an umbrella, and the subfield offices, would they work out of the local police departments or things like that, or would they have to drive back and forth to Jackson?
No, they worked out of smaller space. Traditionally, it used to be in places like the post office or the federal building in Tallahassee or Gainesville. We've migrated, more and more, especially after Oklahoma City, when the federal building there was bombed. The FBI started moving out of federal buildings traditionally and into standalone space. Most of those smaller resident agencies are in commercial space, a bank, a law firm type building where you rent a couple suites or something.
You mentioned that you worked in terrorism in the 90s. Now, coincidentally, I had another FBI agent who was a Eugene Casey, and he actually interviewed who was probably the most renowned or well-known terrorist in the world, Carlos the Jackal. Was he kind of intermixed in what you were trying to do?
I think that was a different time. It may have been just prior to when I probably started working international terrorism in 1995. I can't remember when the Jackal Carlos Ramirez, I believe his last name was arrested, and he probably fit into a small portfolio of interests to the U.S. I'm not aware of Ramirez being involved in any international terrorism that maybe only tangentially affected the United States. So that he certainly was a very well-known, at the time, probably the most well-known terrorist, absolutely. But yeah, I think Eugene Casey was a little bit before my time in that terrorism arena, I think.
Okay, he actually wasn't. It just was a weird coincidence because he was I don't know what you call him. He's like a liaison officer working out of.
So he'd be the legal attaché, is what they call, and the lead. Yeah.
Okay, and
So that's how he probably got to do that. Yeah.
yeah, and they had an opportunity to do an interview that was never done, so they sent him. So he wasn't his beat per se.
Right.
So I guess he was like you were talking about. Everybody does whatever comes up.
No, absolutely. And those legal attachés, they do everything. So in a place like Paris, I think when he was there, it's probably bigger now, but when he was there, they probably had 3, maybe 4 agents. There's probably like a dozen there now. So those guys catch whatever's coming in.
Okay, now you said that somehow you worked the Pan Am 103 case. Can you go into what exactly happened in the timeline?
Sure. And it is sort of an interesting, it's an interesting timeline because of where I was and how I contributed to the case. And in fact, I kind of contributed to the case 18 months before the plane ever blew up. And so I'll put the timeline sort of in perspective. In 1986, I mentioned I was a diplomatic security agent, and I was assigned to a very small counterterrorism component that had just been stood up inside of Maine State in Washington, D.C. There was really only 4 of us that were working there. And we kind of just ran interference. We followed intelligence to try and get the latest reporting from the intelligence community out to our regional security officers in the embassies out across the globe, so they kind of knew what was going on. And in 1986, in October, there was a very small uprising in a very small country of Togo in West Africa. The neighboring Chad had sent guerrilla forces over into Togo for, maybe to try and take over the country or to whip up some fervor or something like that. Now, the interesting dynamic was that Togo was a U.S. ally. Most of the countries surrounding it were all Soviet allies. So they were kind of like a diamond in the rough, a friend of the U.S. And so the president of the country immediately said it was a terrorist incident. He wanted the FBI and the CIA and the State Department, everybody to come over and investigate this. The Bureau had no interest in it. There was no American victims or hostages or anything like that. It was just an insurrection, a border insurrection. So the State Department sent me over. I went with two DEA agents and an officer from OGA, other government agency. They had two explosives experts that were going to look at some explosives and some armaments, and the Togolese government had saved a whole bunch of evidence of this terrorist uprising. Really, it was an insurrection. They were calling it a terrorist uprising, and so the FBI wasn't interested in sending any explosive experts. So we reached out to the DEA, and they were. So the four of us deployed over to Togo in October of 1986. And we went to where the Togolese government had saved all the dead bodies for us. That was really not helpful. We didn't need to see that. But they also had spread out a whole bunch of AK-47s. They had a Browning high-power pistol, a bunch of simplex plastics explosives. Stuff was very old, kind of crystallized. Everything was kind of old. It was all rusted. Stuff was probably 20 years old then from Vietnam War era. And the only thing that wasn't old or kind of rusted out were two, maybe the size of a cell phone today, pretty sophisticated timers. It had digital readouts on them, and they really were kind of unusual compared to everything else. And so we asked the Togolese government if we could take one of them. We actually asked if we could take both of them, but they let us take one of those timers. So I carried that back to the U.S. in a diplomatic pouch, and came back to Maine State and wrote up a big report about what we found. And in fact, we did find some Libyan backing in some of those arms. They came back to the government of Libya that had been sold those weapons. And the timer was kind of shopped around to the FBI and the CIA, and it was eventually made its way to like the miscellaneous timer shelf at the CIA, and nobody thought anything about it. It was 1986 in October. Flash forward to December of 1988, a year and a half later, almost 2 years later, Pan Am 103 blew up. Well, by now I'm an FBI agent. I'd kind of gone to the FBI from the Diplomatic Security Service. And I would say another year and a half after that, probably 1990-ish, I get a phone call from somebody who went on to become a good friend of mine in the Washington field office. And he said, "Are you the same Jim Casey that went to Togo with diplomatic security in 1986? And I said, "Yeah, that's me." He says, "Listen, we need to send you a bunch of reports that you wrote back then. You need to rewrite them like you're an FBI agent because we think that timer was very important to solving the mystery of Pan Am 103. There were only 26 of those timers ever created. They were all created by a Swiss company for the government of Libya. We think if we can prove forensically that that timer you recovered is the same as the other 25 that were ever made, and we've accounted for about 20 of them, it's pretty critical evidence." So I did. I kind of rewrote my diplomatic security reports, put them in the fashion of what an FBI report would look like. That got included into the evidence. And then in 2001, I went over to The Hague in the Netherlands to testify in the trial against the two terrorists who were being tried in a Scottish court held in the Netherlands to be responsible for Pan Am 103. And then you may remember one of them was convicted and one of them was, found not proven. Not guilty, not proven. So, yeah.
I like that. I mean, it sounds crazy, but I like that as a verdict in some ways because it's not admitting saying that they're not guilty of it. It's saying, okay, we can't get you right now. We know you did it,
Right.
but we can't prove it. That seems somehow more accurate.
Yeah, it was a 36-week trial, a very long, drawn-out trial. Obviously, it took, years to put the case together. I actually traveled over Scotland to meet with my counterparts from the Scottish National Police to, coordinate where my testimony would fall in and to relook at this evidence again and say, "Hey, do you remember this? Are these your initials scratched from the back of this timer?" And so, yeah, I mean, it was a very, UK style trial that took place. And we always felt afterwards that the three-judge panel, it wasn't a jury, there were three judges that heard the case. We felt like they're kind of splitting the baby by letting one of them off and only convicting the other one.
Now, from there, did you go straight to working on Timothy McVeigh, or how did that come about? What would be the timeline and story there?
So the interesting thing about the McVeigh case was, in the FBI with a major case like that, Oklahoma City Oak Bomb, we called it, when that happened in 1996, I believe, right? Was it April of 1996?
I'm sorry to interrupt. Can you go into that too? Because I had read that there are only so many, quote, major cases in the FBI. And the Unabomber was called a major
Right.
case, I believe. And Timothy McVeigh was a major case. From what I understand, there was only like 200 of them or something to that point. But can you clarify a little bit? Because I think that's a very interesting topic.
Yeah, so it's probably a little more than 200, especially by now. But yeah, these major cases would have a designator like, major case 117 or 172. I can't remember what, Oak Bomb was. And oftentimes, for example, when Oak Bomb is a good example, Oklahoma City, when a major case like that is designated, they'll put an inspector in charge, to kind of run the investigation because there's so much to do, especially in a place like Oklahoma City. Okay, the SAC is very capable of running that investigation, but it's bigger than even one SAC. So they'd send an inspector in to kind of, direct traffic and get resources and, sort of be the overall point person on that major investigation. Um, the Olympic Park bombing was another one that, that happened at the Olympics.
So what is it that's different? Is a major case almost like its own department, so to speak, like its own budget, its own hierarchy? How does that break down? I mean, how's it different than any other case?
So I think a good part of the discussion, especially really before we had, major quick telecommunications like this, the ability to, have video conferences securely and things like that. Part of it was just a way to have a lot of resources in one place. And yeah, it would be budgeted separately. You'd have a separate line item. The SAC in Oklahoma City wouldn't worry about his gas budget if it was a major case designated, wouldn't worry about personnel, wouldn't worry about any of those things. And it was also a way to capture it from a file standpoint that, everything was going into one file as opposed to any investigation that took place in Detroit that related to, the Obama investigation, for example, the Nichols brothers, right? And one of them lived up in Michigan. So all of that stuff would get designated into the major case.
Okay, so sorry to interrupt, but yeah, go if you can go back to the story. I like to learn about, how things work a little bit. Some of the
No,
different
absolutely.
components.
So we were talking about Oklahoma City. That was a major case. I was at FBI headquarters at the time, and so in the counterterrorism section, it was actually a fairly small section. We had 26 supervisory special agents that were in the counterterrorism section. We probably had a like number of analysts, so maybe I don't know, 50 or 60 of us that were responsible for coordinating, managing all counterterrorism investigations across the bureau. Just by way of contrast, today that division, not it's not a section, it's a division, probably has close to 500 personnel in it, and that's all as a result of the complex problem terrorism has become. But at the time, it was a smaller division, so all of us went down to the operations center, and for probably a month and a half or 2 months, we helped crisis manage the investigation from a headquarters component, sort of like the Pentagon would do for a major military operation. That's what my role was for a month and a half or 2 months when Timothy McVeigh blew up the Oklahoma City courthouse, or federal building, the Murrah Federal Building. So then flash forward to 2001, and I'm now a squad supervisor in Indianapolis, which was basically all of Indiana. So Indianapolis division, there's little resident agencies we talked about that were in South Bend and in Fort Wayne, and there was one in Terre Haute, which is where the federal prison was. So Timothy McVeigh had been moved to the federal prison in Terre Haute. He was scheduled to be executed initially somewhere in the early spring of 2001. You may remember there was a big snafu that occurred about a month and a half before his execution date, where there were at least a couple FBI 302s, which we call our report of interview. Every investigative activity is documented on an FD 302. There were some of those that were found behind an old filing cabinet or something, and it became an issue as to whether or not the defense ever had access to these FD 302s. Now, there were tens of thousands of FD 302s. A very small minority of them were relevant. I mean, knocking on a door in Kansas City because somebody said they saw McVeigh at a 7-Eleven 4 years later would have been documented on a 302. Would it be relevant? Probably not. So even though these documents that were found were determined not to have been turned over to his defense, it became sort of a, hey, we're getting ready to execute a guy, so we got to make sure every I is dotted, every T is crossed. And so it was a big deal that these documents existed. What became a bigger deal when other offices were saying, well, we have bootleg copies of 302s, and we have other documents that all say oak bomb on them. You know, do we need to turn those in? Does the Department of Justice and McVeigh's attorneys have those documents? And it turned into a little bit of inside DC, inside DOJ, inside the FBI, real snafu to determine whether or not the FBI had documents laying around that were relative to Timothy McVeigh that his defense attorney never had access to, that might have proved he was innocent. And I mean, it really was a fire drill. I was sitting in a conference call with all of the SACs across the country, and the acting director at the time, a guy named Tom Picard, he's a really good guy, was basically given these SACs religion on. They had 48 hours to go through every desk drawer, FBI trunk in the car, anything where they thought that there were documents that could relate to Timothy McVeigh, and make sure those documents were delivered to Oklahoma City. And it actually got out of hand. I was designated in Indianapolis to make sure that we had all those documents. I literally had 2 Xerox boxes full of, they were Xeroxed copies. They weren't original documents. It was nothing that related to Tim McVeigh that his defense attorneys didn't have access to that was relevant to his guilt. I actually had baseball hats that said Oak Bomb Task Force on them. Agents threw them into the box. They said, I don't want that. If this has to do with Oklahoma City bombing, I don't want it. So I got on the Indiana State Police airplane on a Wednesday morning, flew out to Oklahoma City, took a taxi cab from the airport to a command post they had set up in a garage at the Oklahoma City field office, and delivered 2 boxes of documents, none of them germane, and many, like I said, hats and plaques that commended them for their work on the Oklahoma City bombing case. So then, flash forward a couple of months, this was resolved quickly that none of these documents had anything to do with Tim McVeigh's innocence, because he wasn't innocent, and it was time for the execution. Well, we had spun up kind of a task force to monitor any threats that would come to that, to his execution, and there were quite a few. There were, we were reading his mail.
Well, his actual act was kind of a revenge for previous encounters with Ruby Ridge and Waco, right? So, I mean, it was a very real threat, I would think.
Correct. And he had sympathetic people out there. I mean, there were small fringe, kind of quasi-militia groups, or people that were, simpatico with him, that wanted to, there were people that said that they were going to break him out, or they were going to disrupt the execution. And so when we were following those threads, there were several of them, and it was an interagency task force. We had all the federal agencies, the state police. We had people from the prison service. Everybody was kind of, doing the right thing to make sure all the information on any potential threat was known. And then the day before the execution, he was executed on a Monday morning. We all kind of went out there about, 6 o'clock at night. And it was in the summertime. It was June. And so it was still light when we got there, but, it was a surreal atmosphere. There were, stanchions with CNN and NBC and ABC. They all had like booths all set up with their personalities in there, with lights showing down onto the quad. These trucks that would show up at a carnival to sell, cotton candy and T-shirts were there. I mean, it was really just a surreal atmosphere that lasted all night, with people just waiting for this execution. We even I got a call from the Indiana State Police maybe 2 o'clock in the morning, and they had stopped a woman on I-69 outside of Fort Wayne. She was going like 80 miles an hour in a convertible with a wedding dress on, with the whole train and everything in the back, and she had a cake, and she was going to marry Tim McVeigh. And so they called and said, what do we do with this lady? I said, she's not breaking the law. Tell her to come on in. Sure enough, she showed up like 2 hours before the execution.
I think they're called hybristophonists.
She came running up, and the cameras all had a big time with her, because I mean, nobody, the TV cameras couldn't get within maybe a quarter of a mile from where the death chamber was set up inside the prison. So it was a very surreal atmosphere. I mean, it's like nothing else I kind of experienced.
Did you ever meet with him or encounter him in any way directly?
No, I did not. No.
Okay. I didn't. One thing that I find interesting about McVeigh and I believe it's John Muhammad, who are the DC
Correct.
snipers, is the feds don't fool around. I mean, they're not on death row for 20 years. He was on death row for what, 5, 6 years?
Yes, yeah, something like that. Well, he was the first federal execution since 1963, though. And then, if my memory is correct, there was only one more shortly after him, also in Terre Haute, who was a pretty well-known drug dealer. I can't remember his name now. Big time drug dealer that was responsible for a lot of deaths. And then I don't think there's been one.
Well, there was a Pakistani who shot up and killed the people out of Quantico.
I was at the CIA,
No,
but
or CIA,
yeah,
I'm sorry, Langley. I forgot his name, but
yeah.
wasn't he in that time frame too?
That's a really good question. As soon as we're done here, I'm going to go research, of course. Because when that first happened, that's interesting. That was never really worked as a counterterrorism case. It was worked as just kind of an assault against federal officers, the CIA officers outside of the gate on 123 at CIA headquarters. Yeah, you're right.
Yeah, I had Tom Pecora on, who was CIA security,
Right.
and that was his first assignment, and that happened like almost right after he got there.
Yeah, I want to say it was like 1995. That was actually right before I got to, I believe it was right before I got to the counterterrorism section. And it was sort of hey, is this terrorism or not? I mean, nobody really knew. I think in retrospect, people think it really was. The guy was ideological. But,
Mhm.
at the time, it was just considered, an assault on federal officers. Penalty's the same, but that's the way they kind of worked it.
Well, is it fair to say too that we didn't exactly want to um, elevate things into terrorism? Like, if there was any question, calling it terrorism could have a even more negative effect of getting people a little worried. Hey, these are terrorists.
You know, I actually think at the time that we just weren't as attuned to the problem, and especially here in the United States, because it wasn't like we were having terrorists come here to, you know, commit an act, and if they did, they told us they would. Um,
Hmm.
there, I don't think, especially early on, there was a known nexus between him and, a terrorist group per se.
Okay, now after McVeigh, that kind of, I want to say, wasn't that sort of the end point of the really, obviously awful domestic terrorism, and we start to slide over to, I guess, modern terrorism?
It's funny because I did have a squad in Indianapolis, and Indiana is a rural area. We had people that considered themselves, militia types. They would meet for firearms training on once a month on Saturday. And, many of them were very, strict constitutionalists. I don't think they considered themselves terrorists. They might have been, anti-federal government. But I think there was a dramatic shift in that sort of mindset after Oklahoma City. I think a lot of people said, "You know what? I'm not in it. This whole killing babies thing, that's not, I'll show up for the beer on Saturday morning, but I'm not down with that part of it." And I think a lot did drop off. It still exists today. I mean, I think we call them, these neo-Nazi groups, some of these white hate groups. We're not calling them militias as much, I don't think, but I think there's some of that element.
But they're pretty light on the ground. I mean, like, I'm not going to downplay and say that Charlottesville didn't happen and that the guy wasn't obviously a hate crime person, but that's more unusual, isn't it?
I think that there are pockets of these guys that have to be, that really need attention. They need to be watched. They need to, there need to be FBI investigations on some of them. But, to your earlier point, I do think that there was a certain decompression of that after Oklahoma City, where some of the people that thought they were more serious about this found out they really weren't.
Okay, so now after Timothy McVeigh, obvious terrorism, and were you still working counterterrorism or were you getting more into the leadership role?
It was a little bit of both. So I had a squad in Indiana, and so that entire squad did all international terrorism, domestic terrorism, and we also did counterintelligence. So it was, we had a lot of roles that we played. And being a kind of a smaller division, what happens in FBI smaller divisions is everybody kind of does everything. So if you do have a big bank robbery case or a hostage case or a kidnapping, everybody kind of goes and helps participate and work on those cases. So I was doing a little bit of everything.
Okay, now one thing I've heard, and you can confirm it more later, um, is that in general, with the FBI, a case officer works a case, and an SAC does not show up to a case. They, if an SAC shows up to a case, then something went very, very wrong. Is that a true statement?
Not 100%. I think every SAC has their style. I mean, I tended to be more of an on the ground. I didn't view myself as just a paperwork pusher and don't tell them, I don't want to know what's going on. I mean, I was kind of more of a hands on and like to walk around the office every day and see what the guys and gals were working on. And I think I was pretty, you know, down in the weeds, didn't try and micromanage their work, but just wanted to know what was going on. So, I mean, I tended to go out on things. If there was a big arrest or, a big search warrant that was going down, I'd go. Now, I didn't try and run it. That's what I had squad supervisors, ASACs, and SWAT commanders for. I'd stay in the background where I don't cause anybody any problems.
Okay. Well, I'm curious, and I would love to hear what is the path, on the way up to becoming a SAC.
We joke around a lot about it. We did anyway when I was there. Yeah, a lot of it's hand in the air. I mean, if you really have to decide that you're going to make that sacrifice and that your family's going to go along with it because it's a lot. I moved 7 times. My 4 kids went to 4 different high schools, and that's not for everybody. I'm not sure it was for me, but it's what you got to have to do. My first office was Detroit, and it's a big office. So generally, when you're in a big office, you don't have to leave. So I literally could have stayed in Detroit for 25 years and worked cases and, you couldn't matriculate up to the squad supervisor level, in management, but you couldn't go any higher generally without getting transferred, and at least once or twice to Washington, D.C. So, it was very much like the military in terms of getting promoted, except for we didn't have, although Bob Mueller tried to institute sort of an up or out when after 9/11, when he really felt like he needed to move people around quickly and appoint leaders and get them from New York to LA or, from San Francisco to Boise. He wanted that ability. And it was a tough battle for him because, you know, a lot of agents just didn't want to do that. It was, people wanted to be kind of more stationary.
Okay, you mentioned military, and that actually popped in my head because I was in the Army at one time, and typically getting promoted, people will be moved to another unit sort of deliberately because it doesn't always work out or go over really well when somebody who's your peer or buddy yesterday is your boss tomorrow.
Right.
So it sometimes seems to be more effective to they move them from one company to another company. So everybody in the new company only knows them at that newer rank. Is that a similar scenario?
Yeah, it kind of is. I mean, I know when I first went in the bureau, and for many years after that, you know, they would tell you, you realize you're not going home. And in fact, I have a really, it's not funny, but it's a story that really, drives that point home. There are 50 of us. The first morning, June the 2nd, 1987 in Quantico, we're sitting in the tiered, risers of the classroom. There was a guy in the back row because his last name began with W. I remember his name to this day, but I won't say it. And so the instructor got up and said, "Does everybody know that in 16 weeks' time, you're not going home? The only thing you're going home for is to put all the kids and the German Shepherd with the tail wagging in the back of the station wagon, and you're going somewhere else." Well, the young man in the back of the room had one of the old style FBI briefcases at the time with 2 latches on it, and he opened it up, put his things in the briefcase, and walked down to the front of the room, and we never saw him again. He went back to a corrugated cardboard box company his family ran very successfully, and that just was not for him. So back in the day, everybody got transferred right from their very first assignment. And usually it was you went to a small to medium office like Jacksonville, and then you went to a big office like Detroit, and you could kind of either stay there or you could put in for what we used to have. And I think they probably have something like it now, a once in a lifetime. We called it office of preference, but they changed the name of it. kind of a once in a lifetime transfer to wherever you wanted to go.
Mm.
Most agents said they wanted to go, but then eventually never took advantage of it.
Okay, well, so you were in Detroit, which is a larger office, and you ultimately retired from Jacksonville.
Correct.
Well, why did you want the smaller office to kind of chill out at the end? What was the motivation?
Well, at the time, I was a section chief at FBI headquarters, and I got a call from the deputy director. I had not put in for Jacksonville. We have this very, formal system, or when something opens up, you kind of put in for it. You put your resume in, and then they have a career board. And at the SAC level, the career board may make a recommendation, but the director or the deputy director is going to pick whoever they want anyway. And so I got a call from the deputy director and said, I know you didn't put in for Jacksonville. And I said, well, I'm kind of trying to stay in the DC area. I think I've moved enough. If I could slide over to, Washington field office and be an SAC there, that'd be just fine with me. And he said, I'm going to send you to Jacksonville. And what was I going to say? No,
So, in other words, he said, "Go ahead and put in for Jacksonville."
I never put in. They
Oh,
took
really?
yeah.
You didn't?
Just got
Okay.
orders. The director called me like 3 weeks later and said, congratulations, you're going to Jacksonville. And I didn't tell him I didn't put in, but
Okay. Now, what was that like? What was exciting and new that happened in Jacksonville during your tenure?
so, I mean, we had a lot of good cases when I was here. I was here for 4 years before I decided it was kind of time to punch out and do something a little different. Um, you know, again, a smaller office where a lot of things happen, white collar crime cases, bank robbery cases. We had somebody throw a bomb up against the biggest mosque in town while I was here.
Mm.
And then eventually there was a period where after that happened, it kind of went dark as to who did it. The investigation went cold. And then what happens, like happens in a lot of investigations, there was a really quick lightning lead that came up. And within 2 days, we had the guy pinpointed, and he was in a state park out in I want to say Kansas City and Missouri area. And, the FBI team went out there, found him kind of camping out in a pickup truck, and he tried to shoot him, and they ended up shooting and killing him. So yeah, I mean, there were a lot of things that happened while I was here. Yeah,
Is there a lot of drug issues there, or is that more Miami and that kind of
yeah,
stuff?
I mean, there are drug issues in every town. Here, it tends to be very localized, smaller gangs. Uh, I think probably between the DEA and the Jacksonville Sheriff's Office, which is our local police department here, they have pretty good visibility and a handle. I mean, it's still a problem. It still results in probably, 70% or more of the homicides that happen in Jacksonville are drug related. But in terms of moving, a massive amount of drugs or in drug enterprises like we had in bigger field offices, no.
Okay. Now, you retired from the FBI in Jacksonville, stayed in the area?
I did. I mean, I think after, 7 moves, my wife and I are both from the Washington, D.C. area. We liked the Washington, D.C. area, but we liked living in Florida too. So we just kind of decided, you know, it's as nice a place as anywhere to live. So we're in North Florida and, really enjoying living here.
Okay, now you've moved on and you were telling me a little bit about your new company, which was well, it was FCS Security, but you've kind of spun off. Do you want to talk about
Yeah,
that?
I'd love to. So I've been working for several years for, interestingly, a man who was one of the first people I met when I came to Jacksonville, former NCIS agent. And it turned out he and I literally grew up 3 miles from each other in Vienna, Virginia. Who would have guessed? So
And what's his name?
his name is Bland Cologne, E. Bland Cologne, Prince of Atlanta.
Which is a weirdest. The name actually sounds like it belongs in a romance novel or something.
As he likes to say, is one of a kind. He never has to worry about anybody confusing his name with anybody else. Yeah, but he's a fascinating guy. He was a former Falls Church policeman, became a NCIS agent, moved down here to Jacksonville a couple times. He married a lady from Florida, and I think after his third carrier deployment, because those guys go live on a carrier for like 6 months. I think his wife said something like, the boat or me, and he chose her. So he left NCIS after, 13, 14 years, short of retirement, and started a very small security company called First Coast Security. And he got a couple local contracts, and that was 20 years ago in the year 2000. And here we are, you know, 20 years later, and he's got 2,500 employees, contracts in 12 different states, some pretty good sized federal work in the Washington, D.C. area. But it's mostly a manned guarding operation. I'd say 98% of what they're doing is, guarding facilities, electric
Oh,
companies, data centers, things like that. But for a period of time right after I retired, I did have a small business where I was, a private investigator here in Florida. I had an agency license, which is, required to run that sort of operation. I had a PI license, and did some interesting cases. And so we'd always talked about maybe spinning off and going back into that work. And so we decided a couple of months ago, the owner and myself, hey, let's give this a try. Let's spin off a completely different company. We'll call it FCS Global Advisors, and we'll get involved in the higher end private investigations, background investigations for executives, crisis management, cybersecurity, those sorts of things. And we draw on a lot of consultants and experts. There's a group of about 850 former FBI agents that are doing stuff like this, and we all know each other. And to kind of work this sort of thing, I mean, if I have a case that has tentacles in Los Angeles and in Phoenix and New Jersey, I got this Rolodex of guys that I can go to. I know what their work's going to look like. They know they're going to get paid. It's just a dynamic group of people to kind of work collectively, almost like we're still in the FBI.
do you do any like training for schools and things like that? For active shooter situations and workplaces. Is that something that you guys get into?
We did some of that as the manned guarding concern, because people were calling and asking about that. And so I was going and doing a lot of that. I put together some training materials in between retiring from the FBI and coming to work for First Coast Security. I was the vice president of asset protection at Steinmart, it's a national retailer. And so I put together a lot of things like that about, how to handle active shooter situations, what they should do in the store, crisis management plans, continuity of operations types things. And this is the sort of thing that I think that Bland and I had the idea. Well, people are calling for stuff like this, and I'm stopping doing what I'm doing, helping run the manned security company to do these things. Why don't we spin off this separate company and do things like that?
Oh, excellent.
Yeah.
Now, let's talk about the current situation. And I'm just curious your thoughts about the quarantine or stay at home, or I guess it depends on where you are. What are your thoughts on it? It's so vague. I don't even know how to ask it, but I'm curious, from a controlling perspective of trying to keep people safe.
Yeah, it's a great question. Everybody has an idea on it, I guess. Some of them are more informed than others, and I don't pretend to be the most informed because it's not really my space, right? But I mean, I'll tell you, as the dad of two nurses, that I think the early efforts to try and social distance, my perception of what we were trying to do and what I hope we have done or are still doing is, they keep talking about flattening the curve, and it's kind of been a buzzword. You want to have fewer people get sick and fewer people die, obviously. But where could have really been a nightmare for the country was if everybody got sick all at once. So if there's X number of people that are going to get sick and there's X number of people that are going to die, unfortunately, of this, you can't have that happen all in the same space, because then, as we've heard, there's not going to be any more beds in the emergency rooms for people that have car accidents, heart attacks, drug overdoses, all those things that happen anyway. The healthcare system's not set up. It's like an interstate highway that only has enough for rush hour traffic and no more. And so, I think that as we look at what's going on now, maybe we beat some of that back. But you did hit on a thing about localization. I mean, the United States is a big country. It's almost like we're 50 different countries and we have 50 different issues here. In other words,
We are.
we
We're
have one
done.
response, but does it need to look the same in North Dakota as it does in New York City? Should North Dakota be shut down when they've had 2 deaths? I don't know.
Good question.
It's kind of a rhetorical question.
Well, this spins out of it. And with your rather unique background, I just wanted to run it by you. And this is not only including FBI time, but obviously working private security, private investigations, about getting information. Did you happen to see the charts where they were showing the tracking from the spring breakers on one beach in Florida and how they tracked them everywhere in the country. And I'm just curious because everybody obviously is so fascinated by the spread of the virus, and duh, that's a huge concern. But I have the other concern of look at this data, look at this tracking. Is it too late? Is it too far gone? Is privacy dead?
So I hear what you're saying, and I'm a huge privacy advocate. Don't get me wrong. Just because I was in the government where we invaded people's privacy with warrants, I'm a big proponent that those need to be, very well scripted and authorized and everything else. Huge privacy guy. But that data you were looking at is totally anonymized because
But it's not, because technically I could take any one of those dots and say, oh, I don't know who it is. Let me follow it for a while. Wow, it hits that address every day. I think I've got it narrowed down to a couple people.
Former CIA director Robert Gates, famously said, now I'll paraphrase it because I can't remember the exact quote, but it was something to the effect that, Google and Amazon know a lot more about you than the FBI or the CIA do because they care a lot more about you. And, that's sort of true. I mean, what you said is true. Who's going to do it? I mean, is somebody working at AT&T going to dig into the files to see that phone number that went from Panama City Beach to, Joliet, Illinois? I mean, what's their interest in doing it? They got to have a reason to do it. And then they have to pick which one they're going to do out of those tens of thousands of phones. And by the way, most of the stuff's all just run by AI anyway. There's no person behind it. I mean, theoretically, to your point, there could be. Somebody could go look at it, but.
Well, you're a PI.
I'm sorry?
You'll go. You were a PI at one point, right? You'd go pay for that information.
Actually,
you're looking for somebody.
I'm probably the wrong one because I'm pretty, there are some things that PIs will do, and there's some things that I won't do. I mean, I've never that would be against the law. But I think it would be hard. Okay, let's put on my black hat and say, well, maybe, okay, yeah, I need to find out that phone. I couldn't even tell you who I went to at AT&T to get that phone and track it and all of that. I mean, there's not a department of, tracking for PIs in AT&T for even for.
Well, there is the Department of Tracking for Target. There's a Department of Tracking for people who want to sell ads to people, because that is what seems to be coming out is the government could just go hire Facebook and say, track them.
Yeah, but where did Facebook get the information? You gave it to them.
After a fashion, yes.
That's where all that information comes from. We've given it to all those companies willingly.
So then I guess you'd agree it's probably too late. It's all out there.
I fall into the category for the most part. Who cares? I mean, I don't have Facebook, but I have all the other social media accounts. But yeah, I mean, if somebody back there really cares that much, I mean.
I have a good friend, Jason DeFilippo of Grumpy Old Geeks.
Yeah.
And I had to fall out laughing because he said, it actually is a relief. He said, it's too late. It just doesn't matter. I don't have to worry about it anymore. I'm going on Facebook.
Right. And look, that's an age-old adage, right? Don't put anything in an email you don't want to see on the front page of the New York Times. How many careers have been ruined over Twitter?
Still are. Well, fantastic. And I appreciate you going with this segue.
Yeah, absolutely.
Now, people can find out more about you at fcssecurity.us.
Correct. That's our website.
Okay.
We'll have a new one soon, but you'll always be able to reach FCS Global Advisors by that website right there that you just added. And I'm also on Twitter at Jim_Casey_.
Okay, and I was wondering about the second underscore, if there was a second underscore. So,
because there's another Jim Casey.
Too many of you guys.
I know.
Well, hey, man, thank you so much for coming.
It's been great. Thanks for having me. I really appreciate it.